DFS fans? Welcome back to my channel for Week 2 NFL Cash Game Plays. If this is your first time on my channel, welcome. Let's jump right into it, starting with quarterbacks. Josh Allen against the Giants. In Week 1, Giants defense ranked worst in pass rush grade and second worst in pass coverage grade. They gave a perfect passer rating of 158.3 at Dak Prescott, while ranking second worst in pressure rate and third worst in fantasy points allowed per dropback. Needless to say, I'd bet on the Giants being a bottom 10 defense this year and Allen posting a big game. As just the 16th highest priced quarterback on Draftkings this week, this is the bet I'll be making. Last week, the Giants gave up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers and, more importantly, the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on deep passes, which is Allen's specialty. Let's move on to Tom Brady. The only defense comparable to Giants, and actually worse than the Giants, was Miami's. Game script might not be ideal for Brady as 19-point favorites, but that didn't stop Lamar Jackson last week, and that hasn't stopped Brady before. Brady averages 276 passing yards and 2.7 passing touchdowns across his last 10 double-digit wins against Miami. And now he has Antonio Brown and Josh Gordon to throw to. He will be chalky. Moving on over to Big Ben. Week 1 was a road game where we know Roethlisberger has historical struggles. New England came in on their high horse and having one of the league's top secondaries. Anybody surprised they had a rough week 1 was not paying attention. In week 2, though, Pittsburgh's back at home against the Seattle defense that let Andy Dalton put up a career high in passing yards. Some may overreact to this putrid performance, but others will recognize opportunity and seize the moment. The Seahawks and the 31st ranked passing defense in football, again, not to overreact, but 418 passing yards to A.J. Green less Bengals at home is sad. Bank on a bounce back for Big Ben. Let's jump to Derek Carr. Two things the Chiefs can promise you: lots of offense and terrible defense. Carr was excellent in week 1, tying for the top QB grade, and he carries the benefit of very obvious stat candidates. You're pairing with Tyrell Williams, Darren Waller, or maybe even Josh Jacobs. The Chiefs give up the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. In week 1, they let a 6th-round rookie backup complete all 22 of his non-drop pass attempts for 275 yards and 2 touchdowns. With Tyrell Williams, Darren Waller, and Josh Jacobs all stupidly mispriced, he's a top value QB for sure. A couple others to mention: Patrick Mahomes every week. Yes, Patrick Mahomes every week. Lamar Jackson is a top 3 quarterback value, and he should be massively owned. Dak Prescott, more than likely good value in this new Kellen Moore offense, like what I'm seeing there. Saints Rams is tied for the highest over-under of the slate with a shootout potential, but Drew Brees and Jared Goff will more than likely go lower owned. I don't really like Brees on the road, do like Goff at home. Kind of a sneaky shootout that I could see is Seattle and Pittsburgh. Both defenses give up the long ball big time. Let's see. Let's go to running backs. Let's just lock Allen here. Start with David Johnson. David Johnson is a running back who now plays wide receiver, which is awesome in DFS. Even in a bad game script, he's going to see massive usage. Not as safe as I would like, but he is definitely in play. Moving over to Alvin Kamara. In week 1, we saw Christian McCaffrey put up a record level performance against the Rams. And while that might not be what we can expect out of Kamara, it's definitely in his range of outcomes. Kamara saw better than expected usage in week 1, a true bell cow workload. In 3 career games against the Rams, Kamara averages 10.7 carries, 8 targets, 138.3 yards, 1.7 touchdowns, and 30.8 fantasy points per game. When paying up, Kamara is going to be my first running back I'm looking at locking. Next up, Sony Michel. Patriots to destroy the Dolphins team that has a decent pass defense. That's laughable. And a terrible run defense. Expect Michelle to see a big improvement from week one in a game. The Patriots have the best Vegas implied total of the week by more than 3 points over the next best team. This next guy is solely if Joe Mixon is not there. Assuming Mixon is out, you can get a running back who is more than less guaranteed 80% or more of the team's offensive snaps at only about 3/5 of the salary, or the other bell cow backs. His last 4 games without Mixon on the field, Bernard averaged 80% of the team snaps, 13 carries, 5.3 targets, and 19.4 fantasy points per game. If Mixon is out this week, which is likely, Bernard becomes a top play, a bell cow running back with good pass catching upside, priced at just a mid-range running back. Now, moving on over to my cover boy, Josh Jacobs. It's not often I get to put a Raider, my favorite team, in a highlight spot. One of the benefits of players who play on Monday night games is that their salaries are set before the game. So a player who warrants a more expensive salary doesn't get one. In other words, this is your last chance to get Jacobs at something less than a ridiculous high price. This week he faces the defense in Kansas City that allowed 5.1 yards per carry to Jacksonville. Jacobs is outside the top 15 in terms of price. Jacobs is your top value running back play on Draftkings, mispriced by at least $1,000. He saw a full bell cow workload in week one, playing 40 of the 55 snaps, which is 73%, and drawing 23 of 26 carries, which is 88%. Gruden also said Jacobs is locked into another 24 touches this week, which should go a long way against a defense that ranked worst in yards allowed per carry and third worst in fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs last year. If you're not locking him into your cash games, you're doing it wrong. Just lock him in. Next guy, we're going to look at Eckler. In week one, Eckler played 93% of the team's snaps, which might even climb this week without Hunter Henry and Mike Williams on the field. Until Melvin Gordon returns from his holdout, I'm going to treat Eckler exactly as I would Gordon, meaning he should be priced at a mid-range RB1 rather than a high-end RB2 on DraftKings. He's nearly a lock play this week in a neutral matchup against the Lions. Let's see a little bit of value. LaShawn McCoy. Going over to the other side of this Raiders game, it was difficult to believe Andy Reid when he said that McCoy would be a co-starter. I thought he was bluffing, but after week one, it seems to be closer to truth than fiction. McCoy is clearly a part of this offense, and 4,700 bargain price. Just another 2 quick mentions. Todd Gurley, week one saw him play on just 4 of the team's 20 red zone snaps. He's my favorite contrarian play this week. And with Darius Geis out, Chris Thompson is significantly mispriced this week if you think Dallas maintains the lead for most of the game, which I think is likely. Let's lock in Kamara here and Josh Jacobs. Let's jump down to tight end real quick. And we'll start with Ingram. Ingram got 14 targets in week one with Sterling Shepard on the field. Now Shepard is in the concussion protocol for week two, heading into a matchup against the Bills secondary, meaning the already bad Giants receiving game will run into a brick wall. I could possibly see Ingram getting 20 targets. I don't know. I think it's possible. Let's move on down. Way down here. Darren Waller. Remember when I said this was your last chance to get Josh Jacobs cheaply because he played Monday and his salary didn't rise like it should? Yeah, that's true also here with Waller. Isn't just the best tight end value on the slate. He's one of the best tight end values in recent memory. He's probably about 1,700 too cheap. He sees phenomenal usage, playing 100% of the team snaps and leading the team in targets with 8. Keep in mind, Derek Carr only dropped back to pass 27 times. So, following Oakland's Week 1 win over the Broncos, Gruden said Waller is special. We need to get the ball to Waller. And last season, Kansas City gave up the second most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. So don't overthink this play. TJ Hawkinson. Not really sold on Hawkinson as the next big thing at tight ends this year, only because there's so much reason to believe that the Lions are not going to pass the ball as much or be as successful as doing it as in week 1. On the other hand, he's only 3K. That doesn't make sense. He's cheaper than Adam Shaheen. He doesn't have to be Gronkinson to be worth the salary right behind Waller. Pace of play won't be anywhere near as good this week, but Casey Hayward on Kenny Galladay and Desmond King on Danny Amendola and Derwin James out, I could expect another big day from Hawkinson. Let's go to Delaney Walker. You ever heard the expression, if it's not broke, don't fix it? I understand age here is probably a concern to people, but this guy caught 5 of his 6 targets for 55 yards and 2 touchdowns. Even if we assume the touchdown regression this week, which more than likely he won't get another 2 touchdowns, 25% the target share tells us he is in play for sure in this offense. Just a quick note here on the tight ends. Ingram is a better value than Travis Kelce, but there's no other tight end with Kelce's upside. Last season, Oakland ranked 3rd worst in fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends. Without Tyreek Hill and Oakland without Abram on the field, I'd expect a big week too from Kelce. Mark Andrews is the number 3 value play, followed by Delaney Walker. So much value at this position, I wouldn't be shocked if we see a millionaire maker lineup with 2 tight ends. So a tight end and a tight end in the flex spot. George Kittle got pretty unlucky last week. 2 touchdowns, totaling 17 fantasy points, being called back due to penalty. And if those hadn't been negated, Kittle would have probably scored about 30 fantasy points, which is among probably like the highest or in the top 6 of receivers' points. This week he gets a Bengals defense that gave up the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends last year. He's my number 3 tight end this week, behind Ingram and Kelce, but I do love Waller. I just don't really know about triple stacking Raiders in a cash line. So let's just go ahead and lock Walker into the tight end spot. Let's go to wide receivers. We will start with, it was right there, Keenan Allen. We'll start with Keenan Allen. Allen's usage was low-key amazing for fantasy in week 1. The fact that Hunter Henry is out for who knows how long, and Mike Williams is questionable. While it's bad news for the Chargers, this is phenomenal for Allen. Allen saw the 2nd best usage of any wide receiver. He'll probably avoid Darius Slay on the majority of his routes and should again see terrific volume. Tyrell Williams, another Raider. DJ Chark picked the Chiefs' defense apart on deep balls for 139 yards in week 1. Success on deep passes has been Williams' bread and butter in his career, and there isn't any other receiver in the Raiders' offense you want part of. It's an easy call. Williams looks to be the biggest benefactor with the departure of Antonio Brown, and his DFS price hasn't even caught up to him yet. Last week was a pretty brutal matchup, and Williams filled in nicely for the wide receiver 1 spot. This is a much softer matchup in week 2. I like his chance at another big game. He'll be running 2/3 of his routes against Ward and Breland, both of whom are watching football like you and I this time last year. That's right, they're watching from their couches. With Ward and Breland being so bad, DJ Chark and Conley hit career highs in receiving yards last week. Williams is easily the most mispriced wide receiver of the week and pretty much a lock play for me. Let's move on over. We'll lock him in and we'll jump to John Brown. John Brown has fooled me too many times to count over the years in fantasy, but here I am again, taking the bait. 123 yards and a touchdown are good enough to stand on its own, but 7 receptions on 9 targets and an insane 27% target share is evidence that this may not be a fluke given his performance in week 1, this price, and a matchup with the 32nd ranked Giants passing defense. I think Brown is a great play this weekend. Let's go ahead and lock him in there. Let's move on over to Mecole Hardman. I'm not even sure if I said his name right. Hardman's receiving role in week 1 was pretty frustrating, with only Sammy Watkins playing 65 snaps, playing more than Hardman's, which is 53 snaps. And now with Tyreek Hill out, Hardman, who was originally drafted as a Hill replacement when it looked like the star might be suspended, should see those snaps turn into targets in pretty shortly. Hardman should play on nearly all of the team snaps with Hill out. He runs a 4.33 40, so I can see him finishing similar numbers to what we saw in week 1 with other rookie wide receivers like McLaurin, Marquise Brown, and A.J. Brown. Let's move on over to Fitzgerald. As long as the Cardinals offer some form of offense that we expect from what we saw in week 1, every wide receiver on the team, even what's his name, Demir Bird, who I honestly didn't even realize was in the NFL until last Sunday, is worth at least a look. Fitzgerald played more than 80 snaps in week 1. Fitzgerald is the most expensive of the Cardinals receivers at $4,600. Yeah, that's a joke. Enjoy that. Fitzgerald was a glaring value heading into week 1 before dominating against the Lions, but is now somehow even cheaper this week. This week he gets a Baltimore defense that's especially vulnerable to wide receivers out of the slot. Slot wide receivers compromised 30% of Baltimore's receiving fantasy points allowed last year. That's 4th most. He's pretty much a lock play or near a lock play. Let's see. Next is Willie Snead. Snead played 49 snaps in week 1. That's a ton. So Snead against a struggling Arizona pass defense, that makes a pretty strong pivot for maybe somebody else that you were looking at playing. Let's jump to Juju. Juju only sort of flopped in a game I expected him to disappoint. As always, New England sold out to stop Juju, the team's top offensive weapon. That's easy to do when you have New England's secondary, but I'm not even sure Seattle can stop Schuster if he's the only guy on the field. I like this play. Let's jump over to the obvious Watkins. I'm not sure we shouldn't be treating Salmon like Tyreek Hill, or maybe even better than Tyreek Hill, with the passing volume now pretty much more concentrated on him. After feasting on the league's best outside corners in week 1, Watkins has a top 7 matchup this week against Daryl Worley. So if you want to play this guy, I completely get it. Let's go over to Tyler Lockett. This guy could have killed my lineup last week. He only got 2 targets. Luckily, he did score, but he did run 65% of the routes from the slot. And this is where Pittsburgh suffers. They gave up the 3rd most fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers last year. In week 1, the Steelers gave them an astounding 51.4 fantasy points to wide receivers running routes out of the slot. For perspective, that's 3 times the league average. Threat of double coverage isn't serious this week because for whatever reason, Pittsburgh always leaves their linebackers on top tier slot wide receivers, which is stupid, but that's great for us in DFS. I like Tyler Lockett again this week, just like last week. A high pay up wide receiver in Michael Thomas. Let me throw a little stat here for you. In games, New Orleans opponents scored 20 or more points. Thomas averages 12.8 targets, 130 yards per game. Thomas only had 400 yards game last year, but every one of them came when opponents scored 20 or more points. Last week, the Texans scored 28 points, and Thomas saw 14 targets, while again eclipsing 100 yards. This is just simple math. Vegas thinks the Rams scored 28 points, so Thomas should go off. Let's get out of the wide receivers. Let's jump to defenses. This is going to be pretty simple here. Patriots defense should be extremely chalky. A phenomenal matchup against Miami. You guys saw what the Ravens did. The Ravens again, rookie quarterback Arizona should be in play as well. The Bills defense against the Giants definitely in play. I like the Titans defense. They're pretty cheap, 3,100 against Indy. I know there's one defense, and the Broncos against Chicago. Uh, if the Packers defense did good, I'm assuming the Broncos defense should do good against Chicago, and Denver's at home. So I like these defenses. Let's go ahead and lock in the Titans here. If you have this set up right now, you have two slots left with 7,800 left over still. Man, that's a lot of money. You can get Juju and you can get Michael Thomas. Man, I kind of like that. That looks pretty wicked. Anyways, I haven't played with construction yet, but that's pretty much it, guys. Week 2, cash game plays. Good luck.